Welcome to tonight's Zoom Town Hall with Matt Hall, National President of the Society of Professional Journalists. I'm Randy Shostak, President of the Washington, D.C. chapter of SPJ, and we are delighted that you are here for tonight's event. Tonight we'll be having a wide-ranging conversation touching on many topics, including the vision, goals, and priorities of SPJ, and broad and important issues facing journalists and journalism, such as press access and press freedom, fake news, misinformation and disinformation, threats to journalists, and other issues, just days after the Biden administration has taken office. And we will be taking questions, so please prepare your succinct questions now and throughout the event, and type them into the question and answer section. We will try to get to as many questions as possible, and we'll open up the lines so that people can read their own question to Matt. So first, a brief note about SPJ. The Society of Professional Journalists is the nation's most broad-based journalism organization dedicated to encouraging the free practice of journalism and stimulating high standards of ethical behavior. Founded in 1909 as Sigma Delta Chi, SPJ promotes the free flow of information vital to a well-informed citizenry through the daily work of its roughly 6,000 members. It works to inspire and educate current and future journalists through professional development and protects First Amendment guarantees of freedom of speech and press through its advocacy efforts. The Washington, D.C. chapter is very active with many activities, including our deep involvement related to press access, among other issues, and programs including this one. Upcoming programs include the annual Dateline Awards competition, which has a February 28th deadline for submission, our Hall of Fame program, and other programs that can be found on our website that will appear in the chat box soon. If you're, and it's www.spjdc.org. If you're not yet a member of SPJ and the DC chapter, we would strongly encourage you to join. We'd love to have you. Now, our special guest tonight is Matt Hall. He's the editorial and opinion director at the San Diego Union Tribune, where he has worked since 2001. He manages the ideas and opinions section, writing and editing editorials, and overseeing editorial cartoons, commentaries, letters to the editor, and a podcast called Name Drop San Diego. Previously, he managed the newsroom's social media, was a Metro columnist, and worked as a reporter covering San Diego politics and East and North San Diego County. He's a graduate of the University of New Hampshire and past president of the San Diego chapter of SPJ. He's currently the national president of the Society of Professional Journalists. Before I kick things off with a few questions, while we wait for questions to come from the audience, I want to encourage you to prepare your own questions again, type them into the question answer box, and please keep them succinct as questions and not as comments, because we've got a lot of people here on the event. We'll try to take as many questions as possible. And also, the event is being recorded. So let me start off with a couple of quick questions to get the ball rolling. First of all, we heard news today that SPJ fellow and executive editor of the Washington Post, Marty Baron, has announced that he's retiring in late February. And Matt, I just wanted to get your quick thoughts about that.
Well, I'm actually calling from a DC hotel room. I'll be applying for the job. No, I'm kidding. I'm happy with my current job. I wish Marty well. Everyone knew that he was planning to retire before too long. I think the news today may have caught some people by surprise. What a career. I mean, I was happy to see him be recognized as an SPJ fellow a year ago with a pretty amazing class that also included Jorge Ramos and Nicole Hannah-Jones, and Les Zeitz, and in memoriam Gwen Ifill. Marty has been a journalist at the forefront of major stories, and two things jumped out at me from his retirement note at the Post. One is that as a Red Sox fan, I was grateful to see that he mentioned the Red Sox first World Series victory in 86 years as one of his biggest stories that he covered. But more seriously, he leaves the Washington Post with its largest newsroom ever, which remarkable, flatly remarkable if you think about what's happened to journalists and journalism in the last 10 years. So I wish Marty the best, and I'm sure the Post is going to look for a really good person to take the helm.
Great. So Matt, I'd appreciate if you could next briefly share some of your thoughts about some of the broad goals, visions, and priorities for SPJ, including what are referred to in SPJ strategic plan as, quote, the SPJ's core 4 broad statements, such as being champions for journalists, etc. So if you could respond to the question, I know you could probably respond quite in depth, but I'd appreciate if you could just sort of do it in bullet form so we can continue with the conversation. There's lots to bring up, and then perhaps some of those other points can be elaborated on throughout the event.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I can keep this short for sure. One of the beautiful things about our strategic plan is that it purposely is a compact document. When we looked at it, we thought we could do 3 to 5 years and dozens of pages. And then the pandemic hit, and there was a lot of changes in the industry. And we thought 1 page, core 4 items, bullets underneath it. So that's exactly what we have on there. And hopefully your members have seen that, or you can share our document with them after. You know, the core is ethical journalism, the future of journalism, fighters for the First Amendment. There it is. You can see it right now. And champions for journalism, right? I kind of went backwards. All 4 important items, and you'll see some of the things that SPJ has been known for forever. It's contests, it's training, it's First Amendment Forever Fund and Legal Defense Fund, which all journalists should be aware exists, and we make it really easy for you to apply for that money if you are threatened by a lawsuit or have a tough time getting information. You'll see diversity runs through all of it, which is very important. One of my huge goals is diversity. Another huge goal is activating campus chapters. And so one of the things we're going to do this year is we're going to try to create 10 new campus chapters and some diverse campus chapters. So we're looking at HBCUs and Hispanic serving institutions, colleges with tribal students, and those with high concentrations of Asian Americans. So we're really looking to kind of push forward on the future of SPJ, on the diversity of SPJ, and the strengths of what this organization is, which is its members.
And speaking as the president of a local chapter, I'm very excited about that as well. Next question is, Matt, earlier this month, a pro-Trump mob stormed the Capitol, threatening elected officials as well as the media. Among the indelible images of that day are photos of rioters smashing camera equipment and the words, quote, "murder the media," scratched onto a door of the Capitol. What is your message to the mob and also to journalists here and abroad, many of whom risk their lives to accurately report the news, not only under this kind of duress, but also during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen journalists do in the last year under the COVID pandemic, during the racial justice reckoning that has swept the country, including newsrooms, and more recently with the election being called into question by the President of the United States, not only unfairly, but one lie after another. That mob was frustrating and infuriating to watch. You know, journalists have been targeted before, but like you said, "murder the media" scrawled on a wall inside the U.S. Capitol. Like, I can't shake that image. And so I wrote a note to the membership that we shared with everyone to kind of, rally support for everyone, to really thank the people on the ground, especially in DC. It's nothing new that people are calling the enemy, journalists enemies of the people, fake news, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think a big part of what SPJ does is advocacy for journalists, for journalism. And so we won't stand for that. We're here to support them. And I was very grateful to see the strong statement from the DC chapter about that terrible day. That day is not the end of it. I think there's a new administration, and we can talk about that during this call as well. There are some positive signs already, but we need to be mindful of what that administration has the power to do and how different it will be from the past administration. But I think that was the moment where I think we need to realize that that what's happening in this country is unnerving, that there really is 2 Americas. And for a lot of reasons, that mob was allowed to reach into the Capitol to cause fear of life in congressional leaders and aides and others in that building. And the attacks on the media aren't going to stand, whether it's mobsters or law enforcement. And let's be real, one of the early things that we did with me as president was send a note to all police agencies in the country to say, You can't arrest journalists for doing their job. You just can't. There's a First Amendment that exists, and journalists need to be allowed to tell stories that matter to communities that care. And that's one of the things that we need to keep a focus on. And so that was a horrific day. We may never see the scope of that again, but there may be smaller examples of it. And SPJ is here to say, we're not gonna stand for that.
We've got some questions trickling in, but let me just ask a few more and then we'll get to those questions. Fake news and disinformation appear to be growing more prevalent with social media. And some organizations that call themselves news operations have been accused of promoting and even creating fake news and disinformation. Why is this such a big concern? How did we get to this point? What can be done to counter fake news and disinformation? And what should be done about quote unquote news operations that spread fake news and disinformation?
That's a lot to unpack right there. And we can probably spend the whole hour talking about this issue alone. There's a lot of reasons why we're at this state. I was just looking recently at the Gallup, at multiple Gallup polls for trust in Congress, trust in presidents, and trust in the media. And when Trump left office, he was at about a 34% approval rating. In December, Congress was at about a 17% approval rating, which make our current approval rating of 40% of people who have a lot of faith or a fair amount of faith in the media. 40% seems like a lot, relatively speaking. That means 60% of the people don't really trust or don't trust at all the media, which is scary. It used to be in the 70s, and we've all seen All the President's Men or read the book or lived through those times. People did trust the media, and there was kind of a spike. Trust was high, and it went high through the 90s, and in the early 2000s it started to slump, and it fell below 50% for the first time in the mid 2000s, and that was kind of a wake-up call, but not enough of one, because here we are in 2016. It was 1 in 3 people trust the media. That's horrendous. And so why is that? It's because social media amplifies false information and disinformation more readily. It's because journalists, let's be honest, have made some mistakes, not corrected them as quickly as we could have. There's this echo chamber that we kind of live in based on our politics. TV news, includes, and I'm not talking about the networks per se, but the spectrum that exists between Sean Hannity and Rachel Maddow. Opinion, and I say this as an opinion editor. Opinions in journalism weren't accepted or acceptable decades ago, and now if you don't share an opinion on Twitter, in some places you're not really doing your job. So all of this complicates the issue, but I would say at its heart, there's a difference between misinformation and disinformation, right? Misinformation can be an accidental mistake. It can be stories that don't have context, or you didn't go to enough lengths to get the right sources in there. You maybe misquoted someone accidentally. Disinformation is weaponized to hurt and to harm and to spread false information. And so you're seeing that more and more. The 2016 election was a very good example of it. And in 2020, we had the president of the United States on basically a disinformation campaign about the election. Like, in what world, in what movie is that even, a plausible scenario? And so I think all of those things we need to grapple with, and the answers aren't easy. I think Joy Mayer and former SPJ President Lynn Walsh at the Trusting News Project are doing some remarkable things. At my outlet, we've started to do some things to trumpet media literacy and to share a little bit more about what we do. We have a microsite on our site called Our Journalism Explained, which walks people through our use of anonymous sources, the differences between opinion and news, how we choose our stories, stuff about news judgment. I think in short, we can pull the curtain back, explain a little bit more about what we do, but in the end, we need to explain to people that a free press isn't free. Journalism costs money, and less journalism costs society. And so the trust issue is really fundamental. It's one we need to address without delay.
And just to follow up on one of the many questions I packed into that.
I don't know if I answered them all yet.
Line of questions, yeah. What should be done about quote unquote news operations that spread fake news and disinformation?
Yeah, that's a huge question, and it's actually one that's come up recently. There was a letter to the SPJ board from chapters in Western Washington and Oregon upset about a journalist in the Pacific Northwest. And the question is, what does our ethics code exist? What was it designed to do? Is it meant to be a guide, or should we be more of the ethics police? And I think you have varying degrees from SPJ members, including on the board, about what should happen in those discussions. And I think today you saw an example from our Diversity and Inclusion Committee, where there was a statement put out about the LA Times reporting about the CBS News executives who kind of created a hostile work environment for Black journalists and women. And the Diversity and Inclusion Committee sent out a pretty hard statement on that, kind of supporting NABJ, which didn't wait long after that LA Times report to meet with CBS. And so I think, there's a role, and it isn't just fake news. Yeah, I think we have to look at all journalists. Real news outlets make mistakes and missteps. We need to decide how to address that. And I think the disinformation campaign is a little easier because I think we can, all agree that shouldn't happen. The problem is you by talking about it, you breathe life into it, right? You oxygenate that fire, it can spread. This was a big question you saw with fact checks during both of the last two presidential elections. Circulating a bad idea, even to debunk it, causes a problem because it circulates the bad idea. I talked about Joy Mayer earlier. She'll tell you about this truth sandwich, where even in one sentence, you couch that kernel of disinformation with the truth or the fact check on either end so that people can digest it. But we know that people's appetite for news is high, but they don't really take deep dives into stories as much as they did. So a lot of times they'll just see it from the headline. And so we really need to be careful all around how we present false information. And I think some smart people will disagree on the approach, but I think we'll all agree on the need to do that to a certain extent.
Great. Well, I see that some questions are starting to trickle in, and I would encourage everybody to get to your keyboard and type in some questions for Matt. Right now, let's open the line for Steve Guyman, if he could ask his question. Steve is a former national president of SPJ. Steve, the line is yours. I think we might have to wait just a minute for a technical.
Am I there?
There you go.
Okay.
Hi, Steve.
Hi, Matt. Hey, thanks for taking time to talk to my colleagues here in chilly DC today. Very interesting arguments about the erosion of credibility, the challenge and the attacks on the press. Is there a role for SPJ in an active sort of way beyond just speaking out the truth of what journalism is all about, how responsible professional journalists do their job? Are there some programs? Are there activities? Are there some lobbying efforts that SPJ can engage in, either alone or in conjunction with other organizations? And is that part of a plan for 2021?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. And thanks for all you've done over the years for SPJ. I appreciate it. I think advocacy is a huge part of what we do. I think this year specifically, to answer your question, is the year where we are going to do a cost-benefit analysis of having a DC presence for some sort of advocacy team, whether that's one person or two or three, whether that group coordinates with a college to defray costs and reduce the price of an office space. I think what you're seeing, and it won't change with the new administration, is that the need for a federal lobbying arm of this organization, I personally believe it's immense. I think that it would go a long way. We just don't have it right now. We have our attorney who can help us. We have a legal defense committee that kind of can handle some particular requests that come in. And we work, to your question, with other journalism groups, both the affinity organizations and others, to target specific issues. And we have lobbied in the past. Like, we were very instrumental in helping to get the president to sign the Fallen Journalist Memorial. And now organizations can fundraise to create what would be a pretty powerful and needed statement in DC. And there are other issues as well where SPJ has really advocated. DC has taken, and Catherine Foxhall has taken the lead on the PIO issue and really making sure that public agencies and entities, don't put a lid on information, that the public's business is the public's business. And so I'm appreciative of that. And so I think this year specifically what we're going to do is figure out how to get a presence and what it will cost, so we can either move forward or decide to focus in other areas in the short term. So that's one way. And then the second way is working with other organizations on a handful of issues. The new administration gave us an opportunity to send a letter to his team and to congressional leaders to say, here's a handful of things that we want to focus on. We've been very active, for example, in the Voice of America issue, sending out multiple releases under Patty Newberry's presidency and under mine. And so that's just one example where we think SPJ has some leverage with the federal government. Now, advocacy obviously also needs to take place on a state level and a local level, but that's just kind of the short version of what can be done this year for the federal level.
Great. Well, we've got some other questions coming in. Let's go to Mary Crowley for her to ask her question, please. Mary, the line is yours.
Thank you. That actually works, although the screen thing is not. Given what you've just said about trust in the media, which would be before Steve's question, news media credibility and the First Amendment concerns, what is it that SPJ is thinking or advising members on whether the media, operations, outlets, whatever, or individual journalists should be cooperating with the FBI investigation to find participants in the riot? Should they be sharing their digital photos? Should they be not allowing the FBI to see them, etc.? I'm most concerned about the access and to the photos and those being borrowed from any of our media and used in the investigation for that purpose. What is the correct way to be thinking about this?
That's a great question, and I haven't given that a lot of thought. It has not come up at the SPJ level. I mean, just at first blush, I'd be troubled by journalists working with government agencies that they are watchdogging. You know, this is an unusual situation in that these are, you know, you pick the word you want to use, rioters, insurrectionists, etc. But it gives me kind of pause and discomfort to think that journalists would be turning over notes and video and audio of that. There's plenty of video in the public realm already that has been aired or published, you know. And so I guess I would defer to ethical minds who might be able to have more of a thoughtful, deeper discussion. But at first blush, it makes me really uncomfortable that there would be some kind of partnership about that. I mean, think of all the other opportunities where we've been asked to turn over notes and we decline, you know, for some of the same reasons I just articulated. I think it would give a lot of people beyond me discomfort. Thanks for that question, Mary.
Thank you, Mary, for that question. So next, let's go to Steve Taylor. If we can open his line for him to ask his question. Steve, you're on mute. There you go.
I'm unmuted. How's everybody doing?
Great.
Hi, Steve.
Question for Matt Hall. Do you believe the White House press corps and the Biden administration can get back to the more respectful tone of previous administrations? And if you do think so, what should reporters and photographers do to bring it about?
Well, I think that the tone for that is set largely by the president and the president's administration. And I think you're seeing with this new press secretary that there will be regular press briefings, that officials will come to the press briefings, and that as a result, I think would be a little bit more of a respectful conversation. Now, that said, I think the goal is always to treat others as you would want to be treated yourself. And so, you know, a lot of journalists kind of, you know, get on TV for yelling questions when someone's leaving an audience. That looks good. But is that a way to ask a question? I leave that to other journalists to decide. You know, there is I think when critics say that journalists are showboating or asking questions that we know we aren't going to get an answer to, that's different than sitting down in a room and asking someone a question, right? So I think respect is a two-way street, and I think this new administration is setting a different tone, clearly. But you got to remember that this new administration, Joe Biden was in the Obama administration, which before the Trump administration was the worst administration in many ways for journalists in history, right? Obama administration went after whistleblowers and reporters more than any other. It made freedom of information requests difficult and kind of blocked access to information in ways that other administrations maybe hadn't. Trump obviously next leveled that with his rhetoric, went off the charts. So I'm hoping that Joe Biden and his team not only sets a tone of respect, but approaches the job with an understanding that, the public's business is best handled in public. And I think with the VOA and the press secretary, you're starting to see that. But I think the jury's out and it's early. So I think we'll have some time to evaluate and see what happens. But I think journalists should trust but verify, to use the old cliche. And I think that applies. But again, I do want to make the point that we should be respectful of others as well. And so I understand some of the criticism that sometimes gets lobbed at the media. I don't think it gets back to one of my major issues with journalism is that we don't do a good enough job explaining to people what we do and why. And I think that explanation would go a long way. That I keep saying that the government needs to do the public's business. Well, the media does the public's business too, right? And the more that we can get people to understand that, I think everyone will be better off, because you see all these news, we're kind of taking the question in a different direction now, but think of all the news deserts outside of DC, all over the country. Huge problem. People don't know what's happening at their school boards, with their development agencies, and go down the list. And that's because there aren't journalists in there asking tough questions of any administration, whether it's a mayoral administration or a gubernatorial administration or a large group asking for questions of the federal administration. None of which is to minimize the role or the job that those national reporters do. It's a tough job, and I'm grateful for their work, and I'm kind of eager to see how this plays out, because I do think that some of the administration's news conferences were really a farce. They kind of devolved into something that wasn't really helpful to the public, let alone to journalists. And so I'm optimistic that will change.
Let's go now to Benjamin Law, if we can open up his line for him to ask his question.
Hello. So what suggestions do you have for family members or friends who don't trust the mainstream media?
It's a great question, and thank you for making it succinct, because I don't think it needs to be more complicated than that. A lot of people don't trust the media. I think what we can do is have conversations with them, not on Facebook where we're flaming people or getting into social media disputes, but talk to people. When Trump won in 2016, our editorial board wrote an editorial the February before that said, "Stop saying Trump can't win. He can." And here's why. Because a lot of people are upset and they're feeling left out and left behind. And so the day that Trump won, I went on Twitter and I said, what you should do is follow journalists and people, regular people in parts of the country that you clearly don't, because you didn't see this coming. And so I don't want to, Trump is he's not the disease, he's more a symptom of it, right? 74 million people voted for Trump. And very many of them probably still would, despite what happened at the Capitol on January 6th. And so I think, to your question, the family level, the local level is where those conversations will go a long way. And I think they can be helpful. And I think we all need to do a better job of listening and kind of getting outside of our bubble. I talked about, the ecosystem of journalism and how the spectrum is, Hannity to Maddow. If you are, journalists are supposed to be unbiased. Opinion writers get to have more opinions. But so what I tell people all the time, especially young students, is, and this goes to your question as well, read across the spectrum. Don't just find stuff that caters to your worldview, but try to get a more broader, a deeper understanding of the world. And so read news outlets, and we can all find them, that are smart about their journalism, are accurate, and that have the same ethical standards as the best journalists. I think it requires a little bit of work on our part and on the reader's part. If you think about it, back in the 60s, there were 3 TV anchors, and that was how you got the news. That was the menu, basically. in addition to newspapers. And now the ecosystem is ginormous. There are thousands of people you can follow on social media to get your news, and people do that. So that's led to the problematic fact that there are two countries and that there are multiple ecosystems where people can get their news. And so being mindful of that and have those conversations, just the fact that you asked the question shows that we need to be having those conversations, and we need to be having them respectfully and listening to people on the other side, because 74 million people voting for one candidate and 81 million people voting for the other, those are records, right? So people are involved, they want to talk, but they don't see eye to eye, and getting them to at least have those conversations, I think, is important.
These are great questions, and I just want to encourage everybody to keep sending those questions in, and we'll get to as many as we can. Right now, let's go to Denise Dunbar, who is a board member of SPJ DC. And while we're waiting for her line to open, Denise is also the editor of a local newspaper. Denise, you're on mute. I wonder if she may have stepped away for a moment. Let's come back to Denise, and let's go to a question from Carol Falk. If we could open up her line, and we'll come back to Denise momentarily.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
I can.
I'm
Hi, Carol.
Carol Van Dam. So, hi, Steve Taylor. we're old buddies who used to cover the White House at the same time. Anyway, I mean, I was just questioning, not for myself because I didn't feel the self-censorship, but I know that some of my colleagues sure did at VOA. And, you know, they're kind of in between a rock and a hard place when you're trying to do your job and not run in the crosshairs of somebody like the CEO who we used to have, and you know, risk losing their jobs if they do. So what do you say to them?
I say keep doing the work that we expect and that you've been doing. You know, that right before the new administration took over, there was a reporter at VOA who was reassigned for asking a question. I mean, maybe that oversimplifies it a little bit, but what happened with the politicization of VOA was unacceptable. The enabling chartering kind of legislation says that they should be free of political interference and meddling. And you can't look at what happened in the last couple of years and say that that was done. So to Biden's credit, he has, you know, elevated some of the people who were whistleblowers and moved some of the people who were political problems out. So we'll see what happens there. You know, everyone, there's politics in every organization. VOAs have been elevated in the moment and are kind of front and center and front of mind for a lot of people. And so I think it must be uncomfortable for the people there. I fully want them to know that I empathize with them and appreciate the work that they're doing under difficult circumstances. But I do think that it'll get better there, and it may get better quickly. I don't know, but the points that you raised, Carol, are big, and SPJ has been watching. As I said, we issued a bunch of statements about that, to the extent that those statements carry weight. Clearly, the new administration came in and didn't waste any time, so they knew that there was a problem there, and they're looking to rectify it. And so, I guess I would just close by saying, if anyone at VOA continues to have problems, let us know. Email me. Let SPJ know, and we'll continue to be advocates for that organization.
Great. Well, thanks very much for that. And let's see if Denise Dunbar is, if technical problems are solved for her to come online with her question. Since she's next in the queue. Denise, are you with us? If there's a problem with her coming on, I can read her question. Let's just give her a couple of seconds here. All right, well, let me read her question. She's asking, what advice do you have for community newspapers to adapt to the current media climate?
It's a great question. I mean, we started, the very first question that I was asked today was about Marty Barron, and my statement was that the Washington Post has the largest newsroom in its history. Well, it's great for the Washington Post, but there are a lot of smaller, vital newspapers that have closed. in recent years. I mean, everyone knows the numbers about the decline in journalists and outlets, and we talked about news lasers earlier. It's really scary and really sad. I think the community outlets, you know, what they can start to do is be part of the community. One of the things that the Union Tribune has done, we consider ourselves kind of a regional newspaper, so not dissimilar from a community paper, although we're the big metro in San Diego, is we've created a community advisory board with a bunch of 15 or so diverse people, diverse in gender, race and ethnicity, geography, political affiliation, scope of work that they do. And so they work with us on a regular basis and give us eyes and ears in the community and give us feedback if we're doing something that we shouldn't be or that might be unwise. You know, when we want to tackle some of these issues that are important of the moment, we can bounce ideas off them. We have a Community Voices Project, which is 50 people who, you know, I run the opinion section, and I got to tell people all the time, you get 750 words once every 3 months on a subject, and that's what you get. And that's kind of an uncomfortable way to have a conversation. Imagine if you're at a bar and you go, okay, 5 minutes, and then you can talk to me again. That's going to be a pretty lame conversation. What we've done is create this Community Voices Project that allows these 50 people to write about anything they want at any time, at any length. Goes online. Sometimes we run them in the paper. Obviously, we read them to make sure that they aren't going to be libelous and that they're accurate. But those are two concrete ways to involve the community more. And you don't have to be a big regional paper to do that. You can do that at a small paper. I think the outreach, you know, working with the community, working towards kind of common goals, trying to make your community better. That's been a thrust of journalism for decades, centuries, and can really help strengthen a community paper. You know, in the end, I think what it boils down to, and this is something new that SPJ is tackling this year too, for the first time maybe ever, is we're talking about sustainable business models. SPJ has never talked about that, you know, and now we're starting to realize advertising models blown up, sponsorship model is tricky, membership models make a lot of sense. So how do we look at all these ways that we can have journalism be sustainable? How do we help our members see the wisdom of some of these options and incentivize and help them? Well, reaching out to the community, getting the community to know that when they support journalism, they're not buying a subscription to a newspaper. They're not giving money to a public radio station or a website. What they're doing is ensuring a strong, and because you can't without a strong journalism outlet or more journalism outlets. And so I tell people all the time, you know, you have to support the UT in San Diego, support the other outlets in San Diego, figure out which journalists you trust and you want to deliver your news and support them, because there is a very real scenario that you can paint in San Diego and every city across America, that there's going to be far fewer journalists in 10 years doing this, you know, because we've seen what happened in the past 10 years. And so I don't know if that answers your question specifically about community journalists. I think it's very important. I think it gets trickier in rural areas where there's fewer people, there's greater distances between that make delivery of a news outlet, of a printed news outlet, hard. But the reality is, in this day and age, everyone's got a cell phone, which means you're a journalist by default. Maybe you don't have training, but you can share something that gets into the world. You can also receive that information. And so I think kind of meeting our audience where they are in the medium that they want to consume their news is a good path forward for big papers and community papers.
These are great questions. Keep them coming, folks. And Matt, you're doing a great job. Thank you so much. Let's go to Hazel Becker next. Let's open up her line.
Hi, it's not me. Robert's here too.
Okay.
Whoop, she made it go away. Okay, Matt. What did she do here? She made it go away.
Here.
There we go. How do you educate journalists who don't acknowledge views with which they don't agree, or even that other journalists may validly hold those views?
Are you saying political views? So how do you...
Or a point of view that, or a perspective that comes out through their coverage?
Yeah. I think that's a tough question. I think journalism has shifted It used to be just the facts. There's a great story I tell where when I used to do headline writing training, you go back and you look at the end of World War II, and when Hitler was killed, the headlines literally said Hitler killed. When Osama bin Laden was killed, some of the tabloid headlines were like, "We got the bastard." So that alone, and like if we talk about the Washington Post, you look at like the most popular stories on the Washington Post's website at any moment, and the headlines are all really engaging, have a point of view. They're not just, who, what, when, where, how, and why. So journalism has shifted. I think we can all agree that when you look at a lot of papers, analysis has bled into news stories. So people are sharing their thoughts about news of the day in also a way that might not have been done earlier. And the aforementioned social media juggernauts, we all turn to Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and you go down the list. And are sharing our views on a daily basis. I think, in our paper at the UT, we're trying to figure out social media right now, and we're trying to figure out what journalists can do. I think it's an open question now. Before, maybe journalists couldn't go to a march, and so what happened was we had a racial justice reckoning that's long overdue in this country. And we talk about the difficulties of being a journalist in 2020. For all of us, well, the difficulty for journalists of color in 2020 was through the roof. The journalists of color, their friends and family were getting sick and dying of COVID-19 at a much disproportionate rate. And then, on top of that, there were issues of trust and respect and diversity and inclusion in our newsrooms, where journalists of color spoke out in ways that people started listening to in some places. Still a lot of work to be done, but that's an interesting question: is what are journalists allowed to do in their personal lives? Can you give money to a political candidate? No. Can you go to a march? Well, maybe. And so then becomes, well, what kind of march? What if I want to go to a right to life march? What if I want to go to an abortion rights march? Those, to your point, Bob, two separate worldviews, and there's not going to be a lot of common ground between those two groups. So deciding some of these difficult questions are difficult. And I don't know where you draw those lines, but I do think having the discussion, and maybe journalists disagree with me, I think having the discussion is a smart thing to do. At our paper, we have a bunch of committees right now that are looking at things like sourcing. How do we ensure that we get more diverse sourcing in our paper? We're looking at language and labeling. How do we decide, there's a lot of bandwidth spent early on January 6th. How do we describe what's happening? Is it a riot? Well, yeah, it was a riot. Is it an insurrection? Yeah, it was an insurrection. Is it a protest? Well, it's got a little farther than a protest. But that discussion of labeling is very important. And it plays again into issues with communities of color, because they have been labeled sometimes incorrectly. And so kind of a long-winded way to answer your question. I would think that the short answer is we need to have these discussions, and we need to, be open about it. I often say, just in closing, if you can't disagree in a newsroom in this country's got bigger problems. So we need to be able to have discussions in a newsroom, and that would go a long way to helping the news and the country.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And just a reminder for folks to keep sending your questions in. And let's go next to Celia Wexler, who is a board member of SPJ DC.
Thanks, Randy. Matt, has SPJ, to your knowledge, ever denied membership to someone who calls himself or herself a journalist, but who consistently spreads disinformation? And I'm not talking about little mistakes or necessarily even working on a flawed publication or in a news outlet, although that is problematic. But if that's never happened, how can SPJ uphold standards for the profession?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I referenced earlier the letter from the 2 chapters in the Pacific Northwest where they've raised a similar issue. I don't know that SPJ has done that. There obviously have been moments in the past where journalists have been criticized for statements or actions. And I don't know, others longer serving SPJ members would know if we've ever excommunicated someone. I would say that we haven't. If we've ever decided you can't belong. I mean, right now, a membership is declining. It used to be that the organization had 10,000 members. Now it has about 6,000, and it's been stable the last year and a half, I'd say. Through a lot of concerted effort by folks. And shameless plug, I have my be a member, bring a member campaign for everyone to just bring one member to SPJ, whether you want to support that member yourself personally and fund the membership, or just tab a friend. But I think so that's a question that I think SPJ is going to have to struggle with. And as I've been going around, because of the pandemic, I have been unable to travel. The board has been unable to travel, which helped our bottom line, actually. But it was frustrating for me. I felt disconnected from journalists at a time when I wanted journalists to feel like SPJ was there for them. And so I made it a point this year, I don't know if it's ever been done, to try to reach out to every pro chapter and meet with them. And so you guys are like the 24th one that I've done. And many of the folks have the conversations, they're not all easy conversations. They get into two issues that I think SPJ at some point is going to have to grapple with. One is the ethics police question, and whether the code of ethics exists as a document to aspire to, or whether it exists as more of a document that says, if you violate this, there's going to be potential problems. It wasn't created with that in mind. Some people would like to see the organization move a little more in that direction, to answer your question, Celia. So that is one thing that SPJ needs to grapple with at some point, and it may be a generational thing where older journalists are a little more uncomfortable, and younger journalists who grow up in social media and don't know a time other than cancel culture see it differently. The other issue is with unionization of newsrooms, right? There's been a big wave in recent years with unions organizing, and SPJ National has historically had a hands-off approach to that, because a lot of our members are managers. I'm a manager. A lot of our members are rank and file journalists, and really support union efforts. And so it seems to me that is an issue that the organization also at some point is going to have to grapple with, and it may be generational. It may just gradually take care of itself over time, because you can frame that as an us versus them issue, or you can frame it as as a newsroom support and as a workplace health issue. So all of this stuff is all about the framing, and they're complicated issues. SPJ has been around, as Randy said at the outset, for more than a century. I'm the 104th president, so these discussions will continue over time. And I don't know if there's an easy answer now, and there won't be an easy answer later. So I think, again, my whole thing is have the conversations. We're a membership organization. We need to be responsive to our members. If someone has an issue, bring it to the board's attention, bring it to our committee's attention, and we'll flesh it out. And this is one of those issues that I think the ethics committee will be discussing in the foreseeable future.
Great. Well, next question we've got comes from a longtime SPJ DC member, Steve Goodman. Steve, go ahead. The line is yours.
Oh, my question was just simply whether, first of all, thank you. My question was whether or not there should be some sort of fellowship or talk in honor of some of the journalists who covered the Capitol riot.
Great idea. I mean, I think one of the things we're doing now, February is going to be a busy month for SPJ. Randy talked about a couple of things, but two of the things that we'll be doing, and one is the SDX Awards, right, professional awards. If you want to apply, Google SDX Awards SPJ, and you can help pad your resume and help your next job prospects. Also, our call for fellows and our call for programs for our national convention. I think those are two places where we could consider, journalists who answered the call that day. And I think that would be a fabulous discussion to have folks. We're also planning what's going to be like an Uber regional this year. We're not going to have individual regional conferences because they're going to be virtual because of the pandemic. And so one of the brilliant ideas that a lot of SPJers had is to coordinate our regional conferences so they're on the same day, which then allows each region to focus in on local key issues that it wants. and also allows us to kind of get economies of scale and have some national programming for each of those regions. And so maybe, I think there'll be a lot of ideas thrown out, and there won't be a lot of opportunities it's a difficult decision to choose which panels to have, which discussions to have. But I think that, that discussion is helpful because it wouldn't only help us kind of process that day, but as I said earlier, it'll help us look to the future and how we need to be able to prepare ourselves for this and react to it happening again. Thank you for that question.
Great. Well, we have another question that came in online asking if you could talk about volunteering for SPJ communities and committees. How can people get involved?
Yeah, great question. Great question. I think in the past, some of the committees haven't had a lot of turnover, which is great. They've had some really great leaders, and the leaders from one to the next have all had their own visions. But one of the things I did, one of my very first acts as president this year, also I think unprecedented, was to have outreach to anyone to say, would you like to join a committee? We have some openings. Didn't have a lot of openings, and I didn't know what kind of response I would get. I was blown away. I got like 140 people raising their hands saying, I would love to serve on a committee. A lot of people wanted to serve on, the more higher profile committees, I guess I'd say, ethics and diversity, and the journalism education program were three that I got a lot of requests for. And again, the 140 people, there's no way to find a seat for everyone at a committee, unfortunately. So we tried to, pick some folks and put them on our panels to have a great sense of diversity in all the areas that I said earlier that we would value, such as geography and race and ethnicity, gender, sexuality, geography, type of professional or academic that you are. And so I think our committees are really robust right now, but there's a big list of people who want to serve. And so what I told them was, we're going to try to find ways for you to stay involved. The committees now, we're capped at 15. And so the committees are really full and really firing on all cylinders this year, doing a lot of cool things. But to your question about communities, we're trying to expand the communities. Right now, as people probably know, we have a very, very robust international community and a very, very robust freelance community. And then a third community that we have right now is a rural journalism community that's run by Al Cross, and that is kind of small but hardy, I guess I would say. And so one of the things we're trying to do is to create more communities and to figure out what those communities might focus on, to give people, partly because there's so many people who want to get involved, to give them a place where they can get involved. And so whether that's a campus community, and whether that's a community for academics and or students, someone suggested today maybe a food journalists community, because there's a Food Journalists Association that recently folded. And I see Hazel's plugging the freelance communities board meeting. Very well done, Hazel, in the chat. I think communities are really a powerful way for us to involve more people. They play into how people want to interact and how mingle, especially during a pandemic, but even after the pandemic's over, a Slack channel or a Facebook group or a listserv. There's ways for us to communicate digitally that bring a lot of people in. And I would also say to all those people who unfortunately we couldn't find seats for in committees, get involved in your local chapter, start a local chapter, get involved in the school. Press for Education is one of the most amazing programs SPJ has, where we try to pair journalists with teachers who want journalists to come into their classrooms or do it via Zoom. So there are ways for people to get involved. And I tell them all the time, I got this list, I'm going to keep it until I'm president. I'm going to pass it on to the next president. That list will grow. And that, I think, is a sign of a strong organization that people want to give back. That's what journalists is all about, right? We all do the day job, but it's a day and night job because we want to make society with a capital S and a small s better.
Great. So keep those questions coming in. I see that we've got the next one coming up from Deanne Divis, who is Vice President of the SPJ DC chapter. Go ahead, Deanne.
Hi. You had spoken about the letters that had been written and assessing the creation of a DC office. Are there other concrete actions that SPJ is either taking now or planning while you're president to address the problems that we've been discussing tonight?
Well, I think the big focus for me this year is you can look at the strategic plan. I was involved in the creation of that and a firm believer that this is a good path forward. So a lot of what we propose is going to riff off that and focus in on that. So that my key advocacy goal is, we can always get involved in the day-to-day issues. And that was a big discussion under the prior administration. We could have issued a statement almost every day, multiple times a day, because he said something offensive about the media. I think at a certain point, you need to take a step back and look at things holistically and collectively and issue a statement when you know it can have its most force. I'll give you an example on advocacy. When we saw a lot of journalists at these protests getting arrested, in some cases getting beaten up by law enforcement, and then specifically when those charges weren't being dropped right away, when they realized that they had arrested and thrown in jail a journalist who was just trying to do their job, we could have issued statements for each of those cases. My thought was, why don't we take a step back and issue condemn the act across the country. And instead of just putting a statement on Twitter, let's direct it to, I forget how many it was, 60, 70, 90, whatever it was, law enforcement agencies around the country to say, we see you doing this. It is unacceptable. And we're going to keep on you because journalists need to be able to do their jobs. Law enforcement needs to be able to do its job too. There's got to be a happy medium there. And it can't involve reporters getting, manhandled and thrown around like rag dolls, which is sometimes happening. So to answer your question, Deanne, I think one of the things I'm trying to do as president is we could get involved in a million things. I'm trying to focus in, and the board is trying to focus in on a few key things. And under an advocacy umbrella, I think, fewer statements might be better, more targeted statements, with the ultimate goal of getting an advocacy team in DC so that we can do more. We're a volunteer board, you know what I mean? My day job is 15 to 18 hours a day. Now later, 2 teenage daughters and a pandemic and a wife who's a journalist and my new PS5 obsession, and I don't sleep a lot. But I love it. I love it, and I think we all love it. That's why we do this. That's why we're all members of SPJ, because it is an organization that for a very long time has tried to be everything to everyone. And now I think we're realizing that there are other journalism organizations that are doing amazing things, and we can work with them, side by side with them, and not try to do the same thing, but all help each other, because a rising tide will lift all boats.
Matt, you can't squeeze in a couple more hours of doing some work as a journalist every day. Let me jump in and ask a couple of questions if I could. You mentioned earlier that we journalists don't do a good enough job explaining to people what we do and why. So tell me, how can we do a better job, and how would you describe to the public what we do?
Yeah, great questions. Great questions. I think explaining getting in front of groups. So in the pandemic, that means in Zoom, but once the pandemic ends, getting into schools. I speak in colleges. I've spoken to elementary schools about media literacy, explaining what journalists do, and it's a big responsibility, because this helped me crystallize it for me a couple of years ago when a professor told me, "You're the first journalist these people have ever met." That's a big responsibility. You see on TV, Russell Crowe and State of Play, or maybe Spotlight, which got it, talking about Marty Baron. Spotlight gets it right, nails it.
A great movie.
People, I think it's the best journalism movie, and I've seen quite a few. We can debate that all night too. But I think having those conversations, explaining, here's what we do, and I just have the conversation with someone. Maybe it's not anonymous sources, maybe it's confidential sources. I don't know that we can change everyone to use different nomenclature, but explaining to people that when we say anonymous source, we know who that person is. It doesn't mean that we don't know who that person is, that it's anonymous to us, And so I think on a specific level, it's drilling down into that, pulling the curtain back. So that's one thing. Get into the community, whether it's a school or a church group, a synagogue, a mosque, a civic club. Get into the public and just build those connections, because A, they'll help your journalism, and B, they'll help your community. So that's one thing. And two is just be more open with the public. Like just in the last week, what we started to do with our op-eds was newspaper practice is to have your byline, your text, and then your tagline at the very bottom of the op-ed. And so we just put those and ported them over to our website, and that's how it is. You know what? It helps you to know who's writing that op-ed when you read it, so you can bring in their background. It helps you understand and kind of know whether to trust or not that piece. So this may seem like a small thing, but it's a big thing, took the tagline and put it right under the byline of our story. So now when you go to our website and you read an op-ed on the Union Tribune, byline, tagline, explaining who the person is, and then you can read the story and have that perspective you need. We've also added language underneath the byline of our editorials. It says the Union Tribune editorial board operates independently from the newsroom, but holds itself to similar ethical standards. And we try to foster civil debate. If you disagree with us, let us know, again, to create that sense of discussion. Super, super important. And so those are ways you can, I guess I would say the answer is twofold, is figure out that ways in your community to do outreach, to preach and teach media literacy, super important. And then look at your own internal steps at your newsroom. And those are two examples that may not apply to you if you're not on an opinion team, but you can do the same thing. I mentioned Joy Mayer. The Trusting News Project has a program right now that one of my teammates is going through, which is how to get specifically conservative members of the public who have such a high distrust in media, how to start having conversations with them. So that, this was a question someone asked earlier, how do you get at that fake news aspect? Well, you show them that you're a real person, that you care about your job, and if you get it wrong, you will admit it. And so just having those conversations, opening that discussion, super important. And so those are some specific ways, but generally speaking, this is an existential moment for journalists, and it has been for a while. And we can dilly-dally as we did for decades and not explain to people well enough the difference between an editorial and a letter to the editor and an op-ed, or we can fully embrace the need to do this and take ownership of it. And it really is our responsibility. It's not their responsibility as readers, listeners, and viewers to understand what we do. It's our responsibility to show why it matters.
Mm-hmm. I want to give you a chance to briefly unpack some of the points from the SPJ strategic plan, particularly the need for diversity. I wonder if you can explain why this is important, what's being missed without diversity, and also if you wanted to expand a little bit more about what you touched upon earlier about the news from yesterday that CBS suspended some executives from the LA due to the LA Times investigation.
Yeah, I mean, and I think for those of us who went, it's been said a million times, but it was said very well at the SPJ annual convention by Nicole Hannah-Jones when this question came up. Diversity isn't about checking boxes. At the Union Tribune this past year, we started sharing our demographic data at a staff newsroom level, at a management level, and at a change over time level. So people can go on our website and look at our demographic data and see if we're making progress towards reflecting our community. And now, why is that important? Because you can't tell the stories of a community if you don't have access to the community and don't kind of serve the community. Having a diverse workforce helps you tell those stories in a better way, helps you understand the need to get into the community, not when there's a cultural fair, not when there's a cultural holiday, but every day. And so, having journalists that reflect the wide diversity of a place helps create a better place, And so I think that's important. So one of the things that we added to our strategic plan, to bring it back to your question about the plan, is when the UT decided to do that this year, and I'm not saying we should be recognized or held up as, we were late to the party, way late. There are some groups that have been doing it for a long time. There are surveys that are taken annually, they haven't been taken in recent years, that try to figure out newsrooms that have done this and what their demographics show. I think DEI is a really important part of this. And so having that data, showing that data, it does two things. It fosters an inclusive workforce and a place where journalists of color don't just want to come, but want to stay, right? And it also creates a bridge with the community. And I think that's important too, as we're talking about recruitment and retention. Recruitment is one thing, but retention is quite another thing. And I think for a long time, journalists have thought of promotions as, oh, your resume shows that you're at this place for a long time. That's bad. You need to show advancement within your company or to another company for it. You know what? That's kind of outdated thinking. And if you want to stay at a place for a while because you like the place and you like the work and it is invigorating, then maybe we need to have different discussions about what a promotion should even mean. Because maybe, keeping some folks, whether they're journalists of color, white journalists, whatever your gender is, having journalists do the work is really what matters. And you're starting to see a lot of younger journalists come along, older journalists being shunted to the side because they cost more, institutional memory being lost, layoffs and buyouts and everything causing problems. And so I think the makeup of a newsroom has always been important, but now you're starting to see that conversation percolate, not just within newsrooms, but about newsrooms. And I think, that is important too, to hold us each to account. And that's why the demographic data on the plan is important, because it's not just an internal discussion. It's saying, we value this, here it is, judge us on it.
Just a reminder for folks to last chance soon coming up to get your questions in. I've got a couple more questions that I'd like to ask Matt in the meantime. We talked a little bit earlier about Marty Barron, who is stepping down as executive editor of the Washington Post after a wonderful career there and elsewhere. He said in an interview today to the Post that the biggest challenge now facing the media was, quote, the level of conspiracy thinking that has become entrenched with a substantial portion of the American public. And continuing the quote, he said, it's expected that in a democracy, people will debate the challenges we face, the policies that should be implemented, and that debate should be vigorous. But traditionally, we have always operated from a common set of facts. And now people can't even agree on what happened yesterday, end quote. So do you agree that this is the biggest challenge facing the news media? I know there are many others, press freedoms, press access, but do you agree that that's the biggest? Why or why not?
I guess I appreciate and respect Marty's answer. I don't think I would say this is the single biggest problem for journalism. I think there's too many problems, and I think that is the problem, that there's too many problems. And so, but is that a problem? Is the Gann grant of facts? Of course, that's a problem. I mean, if you think back to the 2016 election, Stephen Colbert was talking about truthiness. That's how bad it got. It sounds kind of. And now we don't even that. Truthiness sounds like talk about aspirational. Let's get back to truthiness, man, because what we have now is heartbreaking and enraging. You have people, and again, I don't want to make this too political, but the president of the United States told people incorrectly that the election was stolen from him. That's a problem, and so. One of the things that we're trying to do, I talk about the committees that UT has, is look at sourcing and how you decide who to even quote in a story. If you do a story on climate change, you're not going to give the skeptic and the scientist equal amounts. When I was a City Hall reporter, I prided myself on literally counting the quotes and the number of lines I would give each side or the three sides in a contentious issue. So when someone inevitably called to complain, I could say, no, I understand what you're saying, and maybe I did get it wrong, but I went to such great lengths that I counted that there were 10 lines for you and 10 lines for the other person. In those days, they agreed that the facts were the facts. But now we can't even agree that the sky is blue. And partly that's because people in power are, are being civic arsonists. You have social media making it so much easier to spread that. And so the question then becomes why didn't they ban the president from social media before he was going to be in the rearview mirror in a matter of days? What actions can they take as private companies, not beholden, the First Amendment doesn't apply to them. What actions can they take to shut down false information? The fact that we can all pronounce QAnon is a problem. And so I think, Marty's right that this is a major, major problem. an existential problem, but I think there's a lot of existential problems out there. And so that's my thoughts on this issue and on the framing of it. I hope he continues to advocate in his retirement, wherever he goes, because he says things in a very smart way that I think people can understand.
Mhm. Before I ask a couple of more internal questions, I just want to ask, are we the enemies of the people?
No effing way. It's a family call, so I'm not going to swear, but that whole thing was ridiculous. I unfollowed the president of the United States in like 2017 because I didn't want to deal with his inanity. But what he said every day about that is incredible. Like I said, journalists make mistakes. Some journalists don't correct them. Some journalists don't correct them as quickly as they should. But we do the public's business every day. That's what gets us out of bed, is because we want to make this a better society, capital and small s. We want to make our communities stronger so our kids can have places, to grow up that are respectful of debate, inclusive of everyone, and conscious of character. And I think journalists are conscious of character. We have an ethics code that we were discussing earlier. And to Andy's point, it's not meant as we'll kick you out of the club if you get it wrong, but it is a highly aspirational document that we can all agree on collectively are ways that we can do it right. We seek the truth and report it, and we minimize harm. Someone who holds those two tenets highly is not an enemy of the people. They are the people.
Great. So let me ask a couple of more internal kind of questions. If you could, just for a minute, tell us about the upcoming plans for the 2021 convention. Mm-hmm. And I gather that in 2022, we're hoping to have the convention back in DC.
Yeah. And first of all, apologies that we couldn't all party in DC last year. I was really looking forward to that. Although I did like wearing shorts when I gave my speech as incoming president at the national convention. I'm really excited about the next couple conventions. We are obviously well aware of the safety questions that our members and all journalists are asking, both with COVID-19 and kind of journalism security, as we saw with January 6th. And so today, actually, Executive Director John Schertzer, our Education Director Karen Sneath, and our conference planner are en route to New Orleans to see tomorrow, to meet with what, in a perfect world would be our hotel venue where we would gather in early September, and I would pass the mantle to President-elect Rebecca Aguilar. I don't know if that's going to happen because we need to take safety seriously. So our contingent is going to go there and talk to the hotel. Our contract, this is public record, it's a public contract, has a big penalty if we don't go to New Orleans. It's $150,000, which those of you who know SPJ's budget, which is about $1 million, that's 15% of our budget. We were in a deficit for a couple of years. This would maybe put us back in that, would wipe out our reserves. So it's really a balancing act between safety and finances, and obviously safety is paramount. But the board has a difficult decision. We are meeting a special meeting on February 20th. I would encourage anyone who wants to come to that meeting and share their thoughts to try to figure out whether the September 21 conference will be in person or completely virtual or a hybrid. I don't want to prejudge things. Hybrid seems like a pretty safe bet, if not entirely virtual. But as I said, $150,000 that's serious money. So we're hoping that the hotel works with us, maybe gives us some concessions. But that's all. I don't want to get into the negotiations of it. Those will take place kind of privately. But the board publicly will meet February 20th to talk about this. We are going to, before that meeting, survey all of our members to ask them a handful of questions about whether, no matter what circumstances, they would travel and would come. And so I think we're doing this smartly. Huge issue. We'll figure it out. 21 will either be in New Orleans or hybrid of some sort, or all virtual. And we know, because we pivoted on a dime in 2020 in several months, that we held a very, very successful annual convention. So if it has to be virtual, it'll still be a kick-ass conference. 2022, I'm really, really excited about that. One of my big things this year has been focusing on diversity and on campuses. And we are looking at a partnership with a college journalism organization that would be mind-boggling. It would be fantastic, and it might be a one-off, or it could lead to a future year, long-term situation like we had with RTDNA. TBD. But I think that will be a really, really cool conference, not only because it's in DC, but because we'll have the energy and the potential mentoring and all the opportunities that come along with partnering with a student chapter. And then 23, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but we're starting to think of that too. There are some options. If we don't go to New Orleans, maybe go back to New Orleans, maybe move around the country. There is talk, as you all know, of coming back to DC on the regular, not every year, but maybe every other year. I think that would be, I'm sure, I know that your chapter is partial to that plan.
You're always welcome here.
All right. And so there's a lot of options involved, but the two biggest things are, to keep in mind, is we're going to figure out 21 with an eye on safety, and we're going to look at 22 with these really kind of innovative partnerships with students, which I think I'm really super excited about.
Mm-hmm. So our chapter tries to do a lot of things, including being heavily involved in the whole issue of press access and trying to get access for journalists to federal agencies, including the work that you referenced earlier by our board member, Catherine Foxhall. And I know you've worked with Catherine, and we try to do a lot of things like that, and like tonight's event. And I just wanted to ask a sort of general question. What advice do you have for our chapter to really be optimal?
Great question. I mean, I think it would start with, and DC is a little bit unique given, the major outlets there and the number of outlets. But ask your members what they focus on. When in San Diego, when I was president, we were fortunate to win chapter of the year. And then when I was on the board, but no longer the president, we won it again. I mean, and I think a successful board, by any standard, listens to its members and kind of moves in the same direction on multiple issues, which is not to say you can't have debate about your approach or the issues you focus in on, but advocacy is a huge one. Training opportunities and programs, huge. And again, COVID, post-COVID, the playing field is totally different. One of the great things we did was once a year, we just got away as a retreat, not at a board meeting, but just got around and what do people care about on the board? What do they want to do in the coming year? Because the year goes quick. I'm president, and this is like month 5. Like, it's already almost halfway through the year. Like, it's crazy. Time flies, and there's a lot to do, and this is the time to do it. So I guess my advice to any chapter, including yours, is, talk amongst yourselves as a board, listen to your members, and then get a handful of things and just go after it. And if advocacy is your thing, and in DC it makes a lot of sense that it is, as I said, your forceful statement on January 6th was very much appreciated and right on the money. I think that goes a long way. And I think national can help, again, amplify some of these messages coming out of the local chapters. So, don't be shy of letting us know that you're doing something or have something in mind. And I think, Catherine and others have made access a core issue. And I think DC is known for that. And I would encourage you to continue that. Catherine's like a pit bull. She's not going to let that issue go. Pity the poor PIO who gets in her way, who doesn't agree with the righteous way that she sees things and pushes for things. So I don't know, there's not really specific advice for you. The point is, you guys are on the right track. I also would say in closing, one last thing. There are many chapters doing cool things around the country, and we're trying to have programs in a box. You can look at Florida, which has won chapter of the year like 27 times in the last 30 years or whatever it is. They've done some really innovative stuff. I think we can all learn from other chapters. And so I would encourage you guys to do that too, to ask around.
Great. Well, we are coming up to 8 o'clock, and I just wanted to kick it over to you, Matt, for a closing statement to sort of wrap it all up and leave us encouraged and raring to continue doing our work.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I appreciate the time tonight. Some of these questions were good. They're hard questions, but you know what? This is a hard moment. It's a hard moment for SPJ. It's a hard moment for journalists. It's a really hard moment for journalists of color. And so I think, look, we're in this together. And I think we need to approach this on parallel paths where we're really working with each other, with the journalism community, to make what we do stronger and better. and to work on that parallel path and really get the community to understand what we do. And really that involves listening, I think. We do make mistakes. We need to be mindful of that. We need to listen to different worldviews. But at the end of the day, we have an ethics code that matters. We seek the truth and report it, and we minimize harm. And those two things, are super important. And that's what separates us from some blogger in their basement. Not to bemoan basements. We don't even have basements in San Diego because of earthquakes. There's a real need for real news. And I guess in closing, I would just say, all this talk about fake news, that's fine. Fake news will be a problem. I don't mean to minimize it. It's a major problem. We need to grapple with it. But if we can all agree on what real news is and why real news matters and how and why people should support real news, then the fake news conversation becomes less consequential. And we focus more on the stuff that matters. And I think that's where my heart is and where I'm trying to help. And I just really appreciate everyone here helping, not just SPJ and not just journalism, but the public understand why what we do is so important.
Wonderful. Well, Matt, thank you so much. It's been a delight to have you here tonight. We have had about 30 people online, and on behalf of them and on behalf of SPJ DC, I really want to thank you for joining us tonight, for answering all of our questions, and for just being a wonderful example of great journalism work and providing fire and light to the people online to continue doing our work in journalism. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I would just say too, smallhalls@gmail.com is my email address. Gets to me directly, mhall@spj.org if you want to go that route. If you have an issue, a question coming forward in the next year or beyond, I'm always quick with a reply. So please reach out. And thank you very much, Randy. I appreciated the night.
Thank you so much. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you.